Chapter number 9 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, 1769 to 1770. New Zealand. Leaving the Society Islands on the 9th of August, they were off Ohetiroa, Rurutu, in the central group on the 14th, but the natives were unfriendly and they did not land. A canoe came out to meet the pinnace, which had been sent to obtain information. The occupants, on being presented with gifts, tried to steal the lot, and were fired over, but by some mischance one of the natives was slightly wounded in the head, whereupon they hurriedly retreated, and further attempts at communication were abandoned. From this place the course was laid to the south to strike the much talked of southern continent. The weather rapidly got colder, and the pigs and fowls began to sicken and die. On the 26th of August they celebrated the anniversary of leaving England by cutting a Cheshire cheese and tapping a cask of porter, which proved excellent. On the 28th an unfortunate death occurred. The boatswain's mate, John Reading, was given some rum by his chief, and it is supposed drunk it all off at once, for he was shortly afterwards found to be very drunk, and was taken to his berth, but next morning was past recovery. On the 2nd of September, in latitude 40 degrees 22 minutes south, the weather was very bad, and having not the least visible signs of land, Cook again turned northwards, in order to get better weather and then to push west. The continuous swell convinced him there was no large body of land to the south for many leagues. Towards the end of September, frequent signs were noted of being near land, floating seaweed, wood, and the difference in the birds, etc. So a gallon of rum was offered to the first to sight land, and on the 7th of October the North Island of New Zealand, never before approached from the east by Europeans, was seen by a boy named Nicholas Young, the servant of Mr. Perry, surgeon's mate. The boy's name is omitted from the early muster sheets of the ship, but appears on the 18th of April 1769, entered as A.B., in the place of Peter Flower, drowned. Cook named the point seen, the southwest point of Poverty Bay, Young Nick's Head. Tasman had discovered the west coast in 1642, and had given it the name of Staten Land, but he never set foot on shore. He was driven away by the natives, who killed 4 of his men, and named the place Massacre, now Golden, Bay. He sailed along the northwest coast, giving the headlands the names they still bear. Dalrymple held that this land discovered by Tasman was the west coast of the looked-for Terra Australis Incognita, and his theory was now shattered. Land in New Zealand. Nearing the coast a bay was discovered into which the ship sailed, and let go her anchor near the mouth of a small river, not far from where the town of Gisborne now stands. Plenty of smoke was seen, showing the country was inhabited, and the pinnace and yawl were manned and armed, and Cook landed on the east side of the river. Some natives were seen on the other side, and to try to open communications, the yawl, pulled by 4 boys, entered the river, whilst Cook followed up the natives, who had retreated towards some huts about 300 yards away. Some Maoris, thinking the boys would be an easy prey, tried to steal on the yawl, but the coxswain of the pinnace, observing them, called the boat back. one of the Māoris raised his spear to throw, and the coxswain fired over his head, causing a moment's pause of surprise. But seeing nothing further, he again prepared to throw his spear, so the coxswain shot him, and his friends retreated at once, leaving the body behind. Cook at once ordered a return to the ship, as it was now getting dark. The next morning, seeing some men near the same place, Cook again landed with Banks, Solander and an armed party, and Solander went forward to the brink of the river to try and speak with the natives, but was received with a threatening waving of spears and a war dance. Cook retired to the boats, and landing the marines, again advanced with Green, Monkhouse and Tupia. The latter spoke to the natives, and to the great delight of the party, found he could make himself understood. After a little parley, an unarmed native swam across the river, and was then followed by 20 or 30 more with their arms. Presents were given, but they seemed dissatisfied and wanted arms. At last one stole Green's hanger, and they all became very aggressive and insolent, whilst more was seen to be preparing to cross. So Cook, thinking the position was getting too serious, ordered the one who had taken the hanger, and who was apparently the leader, to be shot, whereupon the rest beat a hasty retreat. The next day the boats tried to find another landing place, but the surf was too heavy, and when 2 canoes were seen coming in from the sea, Cook determined to intercept them and try to come to friendly terms. However, they would not stop when called on, and on a musket being fired over them, the occupants seized their weapons and fiercely attacked the nearest boat, its crew being compelled to fire in self-defence, and Cook says 2 natives were killed. Banks gives the number as 4, and the Māori account agrees with him. 3 jumped overboard to swim ashore, but were picked up by the boats and taken on board ship. They were at first very depressed, but soon recovered their spirits on finding themselves well treated, and after eating and drinking enormously, entertained the crew with songs and dances. Cook deeply regretted this incident, and candidly confesses that he was not justified in trying to seize the canoes, but having once committed himself, he was obliged for his own safety to go to the bitter end. Banks says that the day is the most disagreeable my life has yet seen, black be the mark for it, and heaven send that such may never return to embitter future reflection. The next day a party landed to cut wood, and was accompanied by the 3 captives, whom they tried to persuade to join their friends. The suggestion was declined, as they professed to be afraid of being eaten, and after a time went and hid in some bushes. Cook, noticing several parties of armed natives advancing in a threatening manner, retired his woodcutters across the river. About 150 to 200 Māoris gathered on the opposite bank. Tupia was put forward to parley, and some presents were shown, and at length one man came over who received a present from each of the British and then rejoined his friends. Cook then returned to the ship, taking with him the 3 youths, who still seemed afraid of their own countrymen. They were again landed the next morning as the ship was about to sail, and though they still professed to be frightened, were now seen walking away in friendly converse with some who had come to meet them. Native account. Mr. Pollack, a New Zealand resident, gives an account in his New Zealand, which he gathered from the children of natives who were present at the landing of Cook. The tribe, then living in the neighbourhood, were recent arrivals, their leader being Te Ratu, the first man killed by the English. The natives were anxious to avenge him, but were afraid of the thunderbolts which killed at a long distance. Some indeed went so far as to say that they felt ill if an Englishman looked at them. The idea of revenge was only ended on the vessel leaving. Mr. Pollack's chief witness was the son of a man who was wounded by a ball in the shoulder, but survived his wound till within a year or two of 1836, the time the information was obtained. Before the ship left, a sort of peace was patched up by means of presents, and dead bodies which had been left where they fell, apparently as a protest, were removed. Cook describes the country as a narrow slip of low sand, backed by well-wooded hills, rising in the interior into high mountains, on which patches of snow could be seen. That it was fairly populated was evident from the smoke rising through the trees, more especially in the valleys leading into Poverty Bay, as he named it, because they were unable to get anything but a small quantity of wood. At Hawke's Bay, whilst trading was going on, a large war canoe came up, and occupants received some presents. Cook noticed a man wearing a cloak of some black skin, and offered a piece of red cloth for it. The owner took it off, but would not part with it till he received the cloth, and then his boat was pushed off from the ship, and Cook lost both his cloak and his cloth. Soon after, a determined attempt was made to steal Tupier's boy, Tayeto, who was handing some things down to a canoe. The Māoris had to be fired on, and in the consequent confusion the boy jumped into the water and swam to the ship. The point off which this occurred was named Cape Kidnapper. As there was no appearance of a harbour, Cook altered his course to the north at Cape Turnagain, 40 degrees 34 minutes south, to see if he could not do better in the other direction. All the canoes seen along this coast were well made, far in advance of anything they had seen before, and the grotesque carving and ornamental work was admirably executed. The dresses worn were usually two cloak-shaped garments, one worn round the shoulders and the other around the loins, and were made of a substance like hemp, some being very fine. Banks had purchased something like them at Rio de Janeiro, for which he gave 36 shillings, thinking it cheap, but these were as fine, if not finer, in texture. Dogs, which were used as food, and rats were the only quadrupeds seen. Whilst Banks and Solander were collecting, they discovered a large natural arch, which the former describes as the most magnificent surprise he has ever met with. It was sketched by Parkinson, and is engraved in the history. Cook also made a pen and ink sketch of it, which is in the British Museum. Cook's washing stolen. On the 31st of October they rounded East Cape and followed the coast, which trended more to the west. They saw a great number of villages and patches of cultivation, some of the last looking as if freshly ploughed. The whole aspect of the country was changing for the better, but the inhabitants did not seem more peaceably inclined. 5 canoes came out to the ship fully armed, and apparently bent on mischief. Cook was very busy and did not want them on board, so to keep them off ordered a musket to be fired over them, but as it only caused them to stop for a moment, a round of shot was sent over them, and they hurriedly turned tail. The place was given the name Cape Runaway. White Island was named, but it must have been quiescent, as there is no note of its being a volcano. As they sailed along the coast, they met with canoes from which fish, lobsters, and mussels were purchased. and trading seems well established, when one gentleman took a fancy to Cook's sheets, which were trailing overboard (they were in the wash), and refused to give them up. Muskets were fired over them and they fled, and Cook lost his sheets. From near White Island, Mount Edgecombe was seen, named after the Sergeant of Marines. It is a high round mountain, and forms a conspicuous landmark on both sides of the North Island. During this day they had noticed several small villages perched on difficult eminences, and surrounded by palisades, which Tupia declared were Mories or places of worship. But, says Cook, I rather think they are places of retreat or strongholds, where they defend themselves against the attack of an enemy, as some of them seemed not ill designed for that purpose. British soldiers have since discovered that a Maori pa is not ill designed for that purpose. Cook most unfortunately missed the harbour of Tauranga, the only safe port on the east coast between Auckland and Wellington for ships of any size. Native account. On what is now known as Cook's Bay, they managed to induce the natives to trade, and purchased crayfish, over which Parkinson waxes enthusiastic, and mackerel as good as ever was eat, the latter in such large quantities that they were able to salt a considerable number, thus saving their sea stores. After the observation of the transit of Mercury, in which they were not very successful, Wharton thinks they were taken by surprise, the transit occurring somewhat earlier than expected. Green says, unfortunately for the seamen, their lookout was on the wrong side of the sun. The end was likewise as grossly mistaken. They returned to the ship and found that there had been a difficulty with the natives, who had assumed a very threatening manner, and one attempted to run off with a piece of calico, which was at that time a subject of barter. Mr. Gore seized a musket and fired, killing his man. Colonel Mundy, in our Antipodes, says he saw a man named Taniwha in 1848, who remembered Cook's visit and imitated his walk, with the peculiar manner he had of waving his right hand, and also told of the kindly way Cook had with the children. Taniwha told Mundy that after the man was shot, the Māoris landed, consulted over the body, and decided that as the corpse commenced the quarrel by the theft of the calico, his death should not be revenged, but that he should be buried in the cloth which he had paid for with his life. Colonel Wynyard took down the same story from Taniwha's lips in 1852, when he was supposed to be about 93, and says, his faculties were little impaired, and his great age perceptible more from a stoop and grey hairs than any other infirmity. Cook expressed very strong disapproval of Mr. Gore's conduct. Next day Cook and Banks explored a river that entered near where they were anchored, the east side of which was very barren, but the west was much better. No signs of cultivation showed on either. Wild fowl were plentiful, and oysters, as good as ever came from Colchester, and of about the same size, says Banks, were taken on board in large quantities, laid down under the booms, and employed the ship's company very well, who, I sincerely believe, did nothing but eat them from the time they came on board till night, by which time a large part were expended. But this gave us no kind of uneasiness, since we well knew that not the boat only, but the ship might be loaded in one tide almost, as they are dry at half ebb. Cook thinks the inhabitants lived on fish and shellfish, with fern roots for bread, for very large heaps of shells were found, but no signs of cultivation. A fortified village was visited. The inhabitants good-naturedly conducted them all over, and showing whatever they expressed a wish to see. It was built on a high promontory, whose sides were in some places quite inaccessible, in others very difficult, except where it faced the narrow edge of the hill. Here it was defended by a double ditch and bank, with 2 rows of pickets, the inner row being on the bank, leaving standing room for the defenders. The inner ditch was 24 feet from the bottom to top of the bank. A stage about 30 feet high, 40 feet long and 6 feet wide was erected inside the fence, with a second, a few paces from it, placed at right angles. From these the garrison were able to throw their spears and stones onto the heads of their enemies. The whole village was surrounded by a strong picket fence, running close to the edge of the hill. The entire surface of the top of the hill was cut up into small squares, each surrounded by its own fence, and communicating by narrow lanes, with little gateways, so that if the outer defences were forced, each square could be defended in turn. Cook says, "I look upon it to be a very strong and well-chosen post, and where a small number of resolute men might defend themselves a long time against a vast superior force, armed in the manner as these people are." He noticed with quick eye the great failing in these native fortresses, that is, the want of storage for water. In these Māori villages it was remarked that sanitary arrangements were provided, such as, says Beckman in his History of Inventions, did not exist in the palace of the King of Spain at the time. Large quantities of iron sand were noted here, but the use was quite unknown to the natives, who were indifferent to the iron tools or spikes, which had hitherto been such a valuable medium of exchange elsewhere. A large supply of wild celery and a fresh boatload of oysters were put on board. A tree was marked with the name of the ship, the date, and 1 or 2 other particulars. The flag was hoisted, saluted, and possession taken of the country, and the ship sailed again on her journey. At the Thames. Running closely along the coast, they hauled round Cape Colville into the entrance of a strait, bay or river, and anchored for the night, and in the morning they stood on along the east side. Canoes came off, and from the behaviour of the occupants, some of whom came on board at the first invitation, it was judged that favourable accounts had been heard of the ship. After running about 5 leagues, the water shoaled to about 6 fathoms, and the ship anchored, and boats were sent out to sound. No great increase of depth being found, the pinnace and longboat went up the river about 9 miles away, and on account of a fancied resemblance named it the Thames. They landed at a village near the mouth, being well received, but desiring to take advantage of the flood tide which ran as strong as it does in the River Thames below bridge. They made no stay. They went up about 14 miles, and then finding little alteration in the appearance of the country, landed to inspect some large trees of a kind they had previously noted. One was carefully measured, and found to be 19 feet 6 inches girth at 6 feet from the ground, and by means of Cook's quadrant, 89 feet to the lowest branch. It was perfectly straight, and tapered very slightly, and some were seen that were even larger. This was the black pine, to the Māoris matoi, and to the naturalists podocarpus. On the way down the river, their friends of the morning came out and trafficked us with the most friendly manner imaginable, until they had disposed of the few trifles they had. When the boats got outside, they had to anchor, as a strong tide and breeze were against them. They did not reach the ship till next morning, when the breeze had increased to a gale, and topgallant yards had to be struck. When the wind dropped, what was left was against them, and the Endeavour would only go with the tide, so Cook took a run ashore to the west side of the bay, but saw nothing of interest, and concluded it was but sparsely inhabited. Whilst he was away, natives went off to trade, and behaved remarkably well, with the exception of one man who was caught making off with the half-hour glass. So Mr. Hicks had him triced up, and he was given 12 lashes. When it was explained to his friend why this was done, they expressed their approval, and on his release an old man gave him another thrashing. The weather now became very unsettled, and they were not able to keep as near the coast as they desired, but on the 26th of November some cultivated spots were seen, and several canoes came off. Some of the natives ventured on board. To 2 who appeared to be chiefs I gave presents. After these were gone out of the ship, the others became so troublesome that in order to get rid of them we were at the expense of 2 or 3 musket balls and 1 4-pound shot, but as no harm was intended them, none they received, unless they happened to overheat themselves in pulling ashore. A stampede. To the west side of Cape Brett is a deep bay which was seen but not named, and here the town of Russell is now established, said to possess one of the finest harbours in the world, into which vessels of any draught can enter in all weathers and at any state of the tide. The natives were found difficult to deal with, and would cheat whenever they had an opportunity. The ship left its anchorage, but was after a time driven back again, and Cook with a party took the opportunity to land. They were followed up by the Maoris, and were soon surrounded by about 200 of them, some of whom tried to seize the boats, but being driven off tried to break in on the party. Several charges of small shot, which did no serious damage, were fired into them, and then the ship fired a 4-pounder over them, which caused a stampede, and during the rest of the stay there was no further trouble, but Cook had to punish 3 of his own men for stealing potatoes from one of the plantations. He invariably tried to hold the balance fairly between his men and the natives. The country is described as very similar to that seen before, but the number of inhabitants was greater, and though apparently not under the same chiefs, they were on good terms with each other, and inclined to be civil to their visitors. A good deal of the ground was under cultivation, producing good sweet potatoes. A few trees of the paper mulberry were seen, from which the natives made a cloth in a similar manner to the Otaheitans, but the quantity was so small that it was used only for ornament. Tupia, who had been instructed to gain as much information about the people as he could, was informed that some of their ancestors once went off in large canoes and discovered a country to the northwest after a passage of about a month, only a small number returning. These reported that they had been to a place where the people ate hogs, using the same word for the animal as the Otaheitans. Tupia asked if they had any in New Zealand, and the reply was no. He asked if their ancestors brought any back. Again the answer was no, whereupon he told them their story must be a lie, for their ancestors could never have been such fools as to come back without some. The land said to have been discovered may have been New Caledonia. One of the men who had been wounded at the first coming of the ship was seen by Banks. A ball had gone through his arm and grazed his chest. He did not seem to have any pain, and the wound, though exposed to the air, was perfectly healthy, and he was greatly pleased to receive a musket ball like the one which had wounded him. When leaving the bay they nearly grounded, being set by the current towards a small island, but the boats towed them clear. Very soon after they struck on an unseen rock, which was named Whale Rock, but almost immediately got clear, with no perceptible damage into 20 fathoms. Blown off the land. Progress was now very slow, owing either to want of or adverse wind. On the 10th of December they discovered 2 bays separated by a low neck of land, Knuckle Point. One bay was named Doubtless Bay and the other Sandy Bay. The country is described as nothing but irregular white sandhills, and Cook concluded from its appearance that the island was here very narrow and exposed to the open sea on the west. This he soon proved to be correct. Foster, in his account of the second voyage, says that when the Endeavour was passing Doubtless Bay, Monsieur de Surville was anchored under the land in the St. Jean Baptist, and saw Cook's ship, though he himself unseen. In the account of de Surville's voyage, published by the Académie Française, it is stated that New Zealand was not sighted till the 12th of December 1769, and owing to bad weather no anchorage was gained till the 17th. No mention whatever is made of the Endeavour being sighted, and Monsieur l'Abbé Rochon, the editor, thinks it is most probable that neither navigator knew anything of the movements of the other. De Surville mentions having lost anchors in a place he calls Double Bay during a storm about the 22nd of December, and it may possibly have been the one Cook encountered on the 28th off the north end of the island. They were blown out of sight of land on the 13th, the main topsail being split, and next day both fore and mizzen topsails were lost, but they managed to bring up under shelter of a small island off Knuckle Point. On the 15th the latitude was found to be 34 degrees 6 minutes south, with land visible to the southwest, and a large swell was coming from the west, so Cook concluded this was the most northerly point of the island, and named it North Cape. After beating about for some days against westerly winds, they ran up north, returning southwards the 23rd of December, and the following day sighted land to the southeast, which proved to be Tasman's Three Kings. Here Banks provided the Christmas dinner, shooting several Sloane geese, which were made into a pie, and were eaten with great approbation, and in the evening all hands were as drunk as our forefathers used to be upon like occasions. On the 27th, when about 30 leagues west of North Cape, and about the same latitude as the Bay of Islands, no land in sight, the wind rose, so that they had to bring to under the mainsail, but moderated a little the next day, so that they could run in towards the land. Again it freshened up and blew a perfect hurricane, accompanied by heavy rain and prodigious high sea, which caused the ship to go greatly to leeward. On the 30th, Cape Maria van Diemen was seen about 6 leagues off, the land extending east and south. On the last day of the year their position was given as 34 degrees 42 minutes south, Cape Maria van Diemen, northeast by north about 5 leagues. Cook says, "I cannot help thinking but what it will appear a little strange that at this season of the year we should be 3 weeks in getting 50 leagues, for so long is it since we passed Cape Brett. But it will hardly be credited that in the midst of summer and in the latitude of 35 degrees south, such a gale of wind as we have had could have happened, which for its strength and continuous was such as I hardly was ever in before. Fortunately, at this time we are a good distance from land, otherwise it would have proved fatal to us." Vegetable sheep. On the 2nd of January 1770, Cook fixed the position of Cape Maria van Diemen, giving it as 34 degrees 30 minutes south, 187 degrees 18 minutes west of Greenwich. Admiral Wharton remarks that this is extraordinarily correct, seeing that the ship was never close to the Cape, and the observations were all taken in very bad weather. The latitude is exact, and the longitude only 3 miles out. He missed seeing Kaipara Harbour, one of the few good ones on the west coast, and describes the land as having a most desolate and inhospitable appearance, nothing but sandhills with hardly a sign of vegetation on them, and says, "If we was once clear of it, I am determined not to come so near again, if I can avoid it, unless we have a very favourable wind indeed." On the 11th, a high mountain, its summit covered with snow, was seen, and named Mount Egmont. Wharton gives its height as 8,300 feet, and describes it as a magnificent conical mountain surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. Bank notes, on the sides of the hill, many white lumps in companies, which bore much resemblance to flocks of sheep. These were a peculiar plant, Raulia mammillaris, hooker, known in New Zealand as vegetable sheep. Fires were seen, the first signs of inhabitants on the west coast. On the 14th, thinking he was in the entrance of a large bay, Cook ran in under the southern coast, and finding it broken into promising looking bays, determined to run into one and careen the ship, as she was very foul. It is now called Ship Cove, in Queen Charlotte's Sound. Here they were at once visited by canoes, whose fully armed occupants commenced acquaintance by heaving a few stones against the ship. Tupia opened a conversation, and a few ventured on board, but did not make a long stay. Cook then landed to look for water, and soon found excellent supply, and as to wood, the land here is an entire forest. Whilst he was away, the crew got out the nets and caught about 300 pounds of fish. Some natives also came off with fish, and though it was not good, Cook ordered it to be bought in order to open up the trade with them. However, they soon found these people were inclined to be quarrelsome and threatening, and as the ship was in an awkward position, being already hove down for cleaning, a change of small shot was fired at the worst offender, which quickly taught them to behave better in future. They had long suspected the natives were addicted to cannibalism, and now they proved it, as they purchased the bone of a forearm of a man, from which the flesh had been recently picked, and were given to understand that a few days before a strange canoe had arrived, and its occupants had been killed and eaten. They only ate their enemies, but held all strangers to be such. The place where the ship was careened was, according to Wharton, about 70 miles from Massacre Bay, where Tasman's men were killed, and Cook endeavoured to find out if there were any traditions of visits from ships to the neighbourhood, but could gain no information. The natives became friendly as time went on, and bought good fish, which they sold for nails, cloth, paper, a great favourite at first, but when they found it would not stand water, worthless. And Cook says, "In this traffic they never once attempted to defraud us of any one thing, but dealt as fair as people could do." The surrounding country was too thickly timbered for them to see much, but one day, being out in a boat trying to find the end of the inlet, Cook took the opportunity of climbing a thickly timbered hill, and from there saw, far away to the eastward, that the seas which washed both west and eastern coasts were united, and that one part of New Zealand at any rate was an island, and he had thus solved one of the problems he had given him in England. They also saw that much of their immediate neighbourhood was not mainland as they thought, but consisted of a number of small islands. A more sensible people. The population of the district was estimated at only some 300 or 400, and appeared to subsist on fish and fern roots. They were evidently poorer than those seen previously, and their canoes are described as mean and almost without ornament. They soon understood the value of iron, and readily took spike nails when trading, and greatly preferred kersey and broadcloth to the Otaheite cloth, which showed them to be more sensible people than many of their neighbours, says Cook. An old man, who had previously paid several visits, complained that one of the ship's boats had fired on and wounded 2 Maoris, one of whom was since dead. On inquiry, Cook found that the master and 5 petty officers, fishing beyond the usual limits, were approached by 2 canoes in what they thought was a threatening manner, and had fired to keep them off. A second native assured Cook no death had occurred, and inquiry failed to discover one, but Cook very severely condemned the action of his men as totally unjustifiable. The ship had, by this time, been brought into fairly good trim, being clean, freshly caulked and tarred, and broken ironwork all repaired, so preparations were made to push through the straits. But before leaving, 2 posts were set up, one near the watering place and the other on the island Motuara, on which the name of the ship and the date of the visit had been cut, and possession was taken of this land, the king's health being drunk, and the empty bottle presented to the old man who had complained about the shooting, and who was greatly delighted with his present. He also was given some silver 3-penny pieces, dated 1763, and spike nails marked with the broad arrow. On getting out into the strait, a very strong current nearly drove them on to a small island. The anchor would not hold, and only a change in the current, probably caused by the tide, saved them. The southern point of the North Island was named Cape Pallisser, in honour of my worthy friend Captain Pallisser, and the north point of the South Island was called Cape Campbell, after Captain John Campbell, F.R.S., who had been one of Cook's strongest supporters as observer for the Royal Society. When through the straits, Cook was turning south, but finding some of his people were not quite satisfied as to the part they had passed between an island, he took a northerly course till Cape Turgenin was recognised, when he at once went about for the south. Banks says, "At this time there were 2 parties on board, one who wished that the land in sight might, and the others that it might not, proved to be a continent. I myself have always been most firm in the former wish, though sorry I am to say that my party is so small that there are none heartily of it than myself, and one poor midshipman. The rest begin to sigh for roast beef. The east coast was followed down to Banks Peninsula, which was at first thought might be an island, and is marked by dotted lines as doubtful in Cook's chart. When Gore thought he had seen land to the east, and Cook, though convinced it was a mistake, ran out to make sure. On returning, the winds proved contrary, and their progress was very slow, but they several times succeeded in running close in to the land, and from what they could see concluded it was very barren, with high ranges in the interior, and with very few evidences of inhabitants. A favourable breeze springing up from the north, they tried to make the most of it, and by that means carried away the main topgallant mast and fore topmast steering sail boom, but these were soon replaced by others. A high bluff was named after Admiral Saunders, and near were several bays, wherein there appeared to be anchorage and shelter from south-west, westerly and north-west winds. One of these is now Otago Bay, the port of Dunedin. The traps. On the 26th of February it blew hard from west-south-west, so they stood southward. They lost the foresail, and then the wind moderated, only to come on with increased fury about daylight, when their main topsail went. The storm continued for 48 hours, and half that time they lay to, heading south. After being lost for 7 days, the land was again sighted near Cape Saunders, and at night a large fire was seen on shore. On the 6th of March, being satisfied that he had passed the south point of the island, Cook altered his course to the west, and nearly ran on some partially submerged rocks a few miles to the south-east of Stewart Island, to which he gave the suggestive name of the Traps. They were again blown off, but picked up the land again at the western end of Foveaux Straits. Again they had to run off, returning to near Dusky Bay, which he wished to enter as he thought it looked a likely harbour. But the difficulty of getting out again and consequent waste of time prevented him. Off Cape Foulwind, suggestive name, they were again blown out to sea, but soon recovered their position, and Cook describes the land. No country upon earth can appear with a more rugged and barren aspect than this does from the sea, for as far inland as the eye can reach nothing is to be seen but the summits of these rocky mountains, which seem to lay so near one another as not to admit any valleys between them. On the 24th they rounded the north point of the South Island, and on the 27th Cook writes, "As we have now circumnavigated the whole of this country, it is time for me to think of quitting it." He had thus carried out to the fullest extent the instructions to determine the situation and nature of the land seen by Tasman in 1642, and had done it in the most conclusive manner possible, by sailing around it, and thus upset Mr. Dalrymple's favourite theory that it formed part of a continent. In Admiralty Bay, which he entered to refit for the homeward voyage, the sails were found to require a thorough overhaul, for, as Banks says, they were ill provided from the first, and were now worn and damaged by the rough work they had gone through, particularly on the New Zealand coast, and they gave no little trouble to get into order again. The 2 points forming the bay were appropriately named after the Secretaries of the Admiralty, Stephens and Jackson. The opinion was expressed that European fruits, grain, etc., would grow well in New Zealand, and an agricultural population would be successful. Timber of excellent quality was plentiful, and it was believed that New Zealand flax promised to be of considerable commercial value. Fish was found in great quantities, and lobsters and oysters being specially remarkable for quality and quantity. No quadrupeds except dogs and rats were seen, and birds did not seem very plentiful. The minerals, in Cook's opinion, did not appear of much value, but he admitted that he was not an authority on the subject. Banks notes the Southern Islanders appeared to be an inferior race to those of the north, the latter probably more closely allied to the Otahitian type. Many of their customs were similar, and their language practically identical. Tupia had no difficulty in making himself understood. It would seem that even at this time founding a colony in the southern hemisphere had been under discussion, for Cook says that if a settlement were decided on in New Zealand, he would recommend the estuary of the Thames and the Bay of Islands as most suitable for the purpose. Speaking of his chart of New Zealand, Cook points out frankly the places where he thinks he may have fallen into error, and gives his reasons for so thinking, and the opinions of others are worth recording. A dull sailor. Admiral Wharton says, "Never has a coast been as well laid down by a first explorer, and it must have required unceasing vigilance and continual observation in fair weather and foul, to arrive at such a satisfactory conclusion, and with such a dull sailor as the Endeavour was. The 6½ months occupied in the work, 2,400 miles of coast, must have counted as a short interval in which to do it." Monsieur Crozet, second to Monsieur Marion de Fresnay in command of the French expedition that was out in the following year, says, "As soon as I obtained information of the voyage of Cook, I carefully compared the chart I had prepared of that part of the coast of New Zealand along which we had coasted, with that prepared by Captain Cook and his officers. I found it of an exactitude and of a thoroughness of detail which astonished me beyond all power of expression. I doubt whether our own coasts of France have been delineated with more precision. I think, therefore, I cannot do better than to lay down our track of New Zealand on the chart prepared by the celebrated English navigator." End of chapter 9.